What happens when hope is all you have left? A nurse's unwavering belief brings a man back from the brink of death. But what happens when he wakes up? And the one person who stayed by his side may have saved him in more ways than one. You won't. Believe the secrets about to unfold. The fluorescent lights flickered overhead in room 312 at Ravenwood Private Hospital, casting a sterile glow over the pristine white walls. The hum of machines blended with the occasional rustle of sheets as the faint scent of antiseptic lingered in the air. It was an environment that whispered of fragility, of life hanging by a thread. In the center of the room lay Damien Cole, a once powerful tech mogul whose name had been synonymous with innovation, ambition, and success. Now he was but a shadow of the man he once was, lying unconscious in a coma after a devastating car accident. His face, pale and unmoving, was framed by dark brown hair that had grown slightly unruly during his months in the hospital. He was hooked to countless machines that beeped softly, monitoring every heartbeat, every breath he took. To the outside world, he was just another patient. But to those who knew him, he was a man whose empire had once stretched from Silicon Valley to the world stage. Yet now all his achievements and wealth seemed insignificant. Clara Hayes, a young nurse, entered the room quietly, her soft footsteps barely audible against the polished floors. At 26, Clara had been working at Ravenwood for 3 years. And though she had faced many challenging cases, none had impacted her as deeply as Damien's. She had heard of him before, the tech mogul whose vision had changed the way people lived and worked. But now, he was reduced to this, helpless, completely dependent on the machines and the nurses like Clara who cared for him. Clara wasn't sure why she had become so attached to him. After all, he was just another patient, one among many she had cared for. But there was something about him. Maybe it was the way his once vibrant eyes had now become dull and lifeless, or the fact that he was alone. His family, though wealthy and influential, had long stopped visiting, having lost hope in his recovery. His mother in particular had made it clear that Damien's time in the world was over. Yet Clara refused to believe that. Each day she whispered to him, sharing bits and pieces of her life with him, speaking as though he could hear her, even if he never responded. It was her way of keeping the silence at bay, of making the room feel less like a tomb and more like a place of possibility. Today, as she entered the room with fresh bandages and medication, Clara was carrying with her a cup of coffee, a small piece of normalcy amidst the endless routines of her shifts. She smiled softly to herself as she set the coffee down on the small table by the bed. "Well, Damien," she began, her voice a gentle murmur. "I think I finally figured out how to fix the coffee machine. It only took me 3 weeks and a lot of trial and error. You should be proud of me. Who knew being a nurse would come with so many lessons in home appliances?" She chuckled to herself, even though she knew there would be no response. But it was a ritual of sorts, something to fill the space, to let him know she was there. She adjusted the sheets around his still form, her movements practiced and steady. Every action, every word, felt like a lifeline. And today, something felt different. Something was stirring in the air, as though the room itself was holding its breath. As she worked, Clara spoke of the small things, her lunch break with the nurses, the quiet rain outside, and the book she was reading. She spoke with a lightness, as though she wasn't speaking to a man in a coma, but to a friend sitting across from her. In a way, she had grown used to this one-sided conversation, to the idea that Damien was still there, somewhere beneath the surface. "Maybe one day when you wake up," she mused aloud, her voice soft, "I'll tell you all about my favorite books, the ones that got me through college. You'd probably make fun of me for reading them, but I don't mind." Clara smiled, imagining Damien's sarcastic remark. He had always struck her as someone with a sharp wit, someone who would have teased her about her choice in literature. Just as Clara was about to finish her task, she heard the sharp sound of high heels clicking against the floor, approaching quickly. The door to the room swung open, and in walked Victoria Cole, Damien's mother. Dressed in an impeccable designer suit, her platinum blonde hair perfectly coiffed, she exuded an air of cold authority. Her gaze swept over the room with disdain before it landed on Clara, who had been bending over Damien's bed. "Clara Hayes, isn't it?" Victoria's voice was clipped, sharp like the click of her heels. "I thought I'd find you here, playing nurse to my son. Tell me, why do you insist on being here? Surely the hospital can hire someone more experienced than you." Clara straightened at once, trying to mask the surprise and discomfort she felt. She had met Victoria before, but the woman had never been kind. I'm assigned to Mr. Cole's care, Clara replied calmly, keeping her voice steady. And I assure you I'm more than qualified. Victoria scoffed, taking a step closer to the bed. Qualified, she says. Do you think I don't know? While you're here, it's not out of kindness or compassion. You're cheap, convenient, and expendable. You think you're saving him, but you're not. No one can save Damien. The words stung sharper than any needle she had ever used. Clara felt her jaw tighten, but she refused to let the anger show. I'm here because I care, she said, her voice calm but unwavering. And I won't give up on him just because you have. Victoria's icy blue eyes narrowed as she met Clara's gaze, but the nurse stood her ground. She would not be intimidated. She would not let Victoria's bitterness sway her from the work she had committed to. The tension in the room was palpable as Victoria finally turned, her heels clicking once again as she exited, leaving behind a silence that seemed even heavier than before. Clara took a deep breath, letting the air fill her lungs as she turned back to Damien. She smoothed the sheets over him, her hands lingering just a moment longer than necessary. I'm sorry about that, she whispered softly, her voice filled with warmth. But you don't need to worry. I won't leave you, Damien. Not now, not ever. As she sat by his bedside, the rhythmic beeping of the machines became a quiet comfort. It was the only sound in the room, but it was enough. Clara's heart swelled with a mixture of hope and determination, knowing that her unwavering belief in him was the one thing that could keep the flame of possibility alive. The days at Ravenwood Private Hospital had become a blur for Clara Hayes. The steady hum of machines, the whisper of nurses' shoes gliding over the shiny floors, and the sterile scent that permeated the air were all part of the routine she had become so familiar with. Yet despite the predictability, there was always a quiet undercurrent of something more. Each day Clara would enter room 312, her heart pounding with a mixture of routine and hope. The routine of checking vital signs, changing bandages, adjusting tubes, and administering medication had become second nature. But it was the hope, the faintest belief that Damien Cole might somehow wake up from his coma, that kept her going. She had witnessed it before. Patients who had seemingly been lost only to regain consciousness and find their way back into the world. Damien could be one of them. She had to believe that. It had been almost 4 months since Damien had been brought in, battered and broken. His once glistening world of high-tech and wealth now reduced to the sterile, lifeless walls of the hospital. His family, specifically his mother Victoria, had all but abandoned him. She never visited anymore. As cold and distant as her nature had always been, Victoria had given up on Damien, as had most of the world. But Clara refused to give up. There was something about him, something deeper that reached past the powerful businessman facade to the man who was still fighting, even if it was just in his mind. Today, as Clara entered the room, the usual quiet tension hung in the air. She had gotten used to the silence, the absence of a response from Damien, the lack of communication. But something was different this morning. The room seemed charged with a peculiar energy, as if the very air was waiting for something to happen. Clara went about her usual routine, adjusting Damien's IV, changing the bandages on his arms, and cleaning the small wounds on his legs. As she gently touched his hand to adjust the sheets, she felt it. At first she thought it was a trick of her mind, perhaps her tiredness or her longing for a sign. But no, it was real. A faint twitch, barely noticeable but undeniably there. Clara froze, her heart skipping a beat. She held her breath, watching his hand, hoping, praying that it would happen again. She had read about muscle spasms, about reflexive movements in comatose patients, but this was different. This was something more. She reached for his fingers, her hand trembling slightly, and there it was again. Another twitch, a small, involuntary movement. Her pulse quickened, and for the first time in months, Clara allowed herself to feel a surge of hope. She was so used to the stillness that she had almost forgotten what it felt like to believe again. But now she couldn't deny it. Damien Cole was still there. I knew you were still fighting, Clara whispered softly, more to herself than to him. Her voice was trembling with emotion, but she kept her composure. She wasn't about to let her excitement get the best of her. Not yet. The next few days were a whirlwind of new hope. Clara became more vigilant, spending every moment she could by Damien's bedside. She massaged his limbs, gently stretched his muscles, and spoke to him as though he were fully awake. She continued to tell him about her day, her frustrations with the hospital, and even about the small joys she found, like the beautiful sunsets she had started to notice outside the windows. Damien, she would say softly, pulling the curtains back one morning to let the sunlight flood the room. The sky is so beautiful today. I think you'd love it. I used to think the sunsets were just pretty, but now I think they mean something. Maybe they mean hope. Maybe they mean there's still time for us. Clara didn't know why she had started to believe so deeply in his recovery, but it was like something inside her was waking up too. The more she talked to him, the more she felt an unexplainable connection. It wasn't just about him being her patient anymore. He had become a part of her life, a part of her heart. And as the days passed, Clara refused to allow herself to think about what it might feel like to lose him. She couldn't, not when she had seen that flicker of life in him. However, not everyone shared Clara's optimism. Dr. Ethan Morris, the attending physician on Damien's case, had always been cautious about giving Clara too much hope. He was a professional, of course, but he couldn't help but notice her growing attachment to the patient she had been assigned. She had a gentle demeanor, a warmth that other nurses lacked, but he feared that it was clouding her judgment. One afternoon, Clara approached him as he reviewed Damien's chart in his office. She had something she needed to say, something she couldn't ignore. Dr. Morris, she began hesitantly, her hands clasped tightly in front of her. I think Damien is starting to respond. His fingers moved again this morning. Twice. I know it's early, but Dr. Morris didn't look up at first, his pen scratching across the paper as he finished writing his notes. Finally, he set the pen down and met her gaze. Clara, I understand your enthusiasm, but we've seen small muscle movements in comatose patients before. Reflexes, involuntary spasms. It doesn't necessarily mean anything. Please don't get your hopes up too high. Clara's heart sank. She knew he was just being cautious, but the doubt in his voice was hard to bear. But Dr. Morris, it felt different. It wasn't just a spasm. It was intentional. I can feel it. He's still in there. The doctor sighed and rubbed his temples. I want to believe you, Clara. I do, but this is a very delicate situation. You can't afford to get attached to a patient like Damien. It'll only make it harder if he doesn't recover. Clara stood there, feeling the weight of his words, but she refused to let them defeat her. She wasn't going to give up on him, not when she could still see the faintest spark of life in his eyes. I won't stop trying, Clara said firmly, her voice low but resolute. I won't. The following days brought with them a sense of quiet anticipation. Clara's vigilance continued, and she refused to let doubt cloud her belief. Each morning she entered room 312 with a renewed sense of purpose. She had become Damien's lifeline, and he in turn had become hers. The hospital remained indifferent, but Clara felt something changing within the walls of Ravenwood, something invisible but undeniable. Every day Damien was closer to awakening, and one day soon Clara believed he would open his eyes, and when he did, everything would change. Clara had long since stopped counting the days. Time seemed to lose all meaning in room 312. Every morning she arrived with fresh optimism, and every evening when her shift ended, she would leave with a small wistful hope that today might be the day. The hospital's strict routines and the machines that monitored Damien's vital signs had all become part of her world. But there was always the whisper of something more. She believed in it. She had to. Then one morning something extraordinary happened. Clara had just entered the room as usual to begin her rounds. She greeted him softly, her voice filled with the same warmth she had used every day for the past months. Good morning, Damien. I hope you're ready for another busy day of doing absolutely nothing, she joked, smiling to herself. It had become a bit of a ritual, trying to make light of the situation, to pretend that she didn't spend her nights lying awake, wondering if he would ever wake up at all. But then, something shifted. The stillness that had defined Damien's condition for so long began to change. Clara paused, her breath caught in her throat. The sound of the machines, the familiar beeping of the heart monitor, and the rhythm of his respirator suddenly felt different. A subtle but distinct change in the air, a shift in energy. As Clara adjusted the sheets, she noticed it first, the faintest movement in his fingers. It wasn't a spasm, not like the previous small twitches. No, this was deliberate. His fingers curled, just a little, as if reaching for something. Clara's pulse raced as she leaned in closer, her hands trembling with hope. Damien, she whispered, her voice barely audible. Her heart pounded in her chest. Can you hear me? For a moment the room was still, but then it happened again. This time his fingers moved more clearly, pressing against the sheets, as though trying to grasp onto something. Clara's eyes widened with disbelief. She couldn't tear her gaze away from his hand, as if afraid that if she blinked, the miracle would disappear. She stood frozen for a moment, unsure of what to do. Should she call for the doctor? Should she wait for more? Before she could decide, she heard the familiar sound of footsteps in the hallway. She glanced up to see Dr. Ethan Morris entering the room, his face as calm and professional as ever. But when he saw Clara's expression, his own face faltered. "What's going on?" he asked, his tone gentle but curious. Clara was still standing over Damien, her eyes fixed on his hand. "His fingers moved," she said, her voice breathless. "He's responding, Dr. Morris. I swear he's trying to wake up." Dr. Morris glanced at Damien, his face unreadable. He stepped closer to the bed, studying the patient closely. For a long moment, there was no sound except for the soft hum of the machines and Clara's quickened breathing. Then, almost as if on cue, Damien's hand twitched again, and this time his fingers curled inward, followed by a faint motion of his head, tilting slightly to the side. It was subtle, small, imperceptible movements, but to Clara, they were everything. Dr. Morris stood there, his brow furrowed. "This isn't possible," he murmured under his breath, though Clara could hear it. "The damage to his brain. It's not supposed to show any signs of recovery." But Clara wasn't listening to him. She was too focused on Damien. She reached down and gently held his hand, her voice trembling as she spoke. "Damien, please. I know you're still in there. I know you can hear me. Don't give up now, okay?" And then, something she would never forget happened. Damien's eyes fluttered open. At first they were unfocused, dazed, but then they began to sharpen. The vacant expression that had once ruled his face was now replaced with something unmistakable, awareness. Clara's breath caught in her throat. His gaze locked with hers, and in that instant she knew. He was back. "Damien?" she whispered, her voice shaking with emotion. His lips parted, and though the words were faint, they were there. "Clara," he rasped, his voice hoarse and weak but unmistakably his. I can hear you." It had been a week since Damien had awakened from his long coma, and Clara was still reeling from the shock. She had believed it could happen, hoped for it with every fiber of her being, but the reality of it, the fact that Damien was no longer a lifeless shell, had hit her like a wave. When he opened his eyes, it wasn't just a physical recovery. It was something deeper. His mind, though clouded by the aftereffects of the accident, began to clear bit by bit, and the more Clara spoke to him, the more she could see him waking up from his long dark sleep. He started speaking again, his voice weak but growing stronger with each passing day. "I can't believe this is real," Damien whispered one morning, his voice barely audible as Clara sat by his bedside. She had just finished helping him adjust to sitting up, a small step toward his recovery. Clara smiled softly, her heart swelling with emotion. "It's real, Damien. You're here. You're with me." She brushed a stray lock of hair from his forehead, the intimacy of the gesture not lost on her. There was something undeniably tender in the way he looked at her, a soft recognition that had not been there before. "You never gave up on me," Damien said, his voice thick with emotion. "Even when everyone else did. You stayed." Clara nodded, a tear slipping down her cheek. "I promised you I wouldn't leave, didn't I?" she whispered, squeezing his hand. "You were never alone, Damien. You were always here, even when you couldn't hear me." There was a long pause as they simply stared at each other, the room filled with the hum of medical equipment that now seemed like a distant backdrop to the overwhelming connection they shared. Over the next few days, Damien's progress was nothing short of miraculous. His physical therapy began in earnest, but it wasn't just his body that was healing. His mind too was awakening from the fog, and his interactions with Clara grew more frequent and meaningful. He began to smile, albeit weakly at first, but it was a smile nonetheless. "I don't know how you did it," Damien told Clara one evening, his eyes meeting hers with a newfound intensity. "But you brought me back. I owe you everything." Clara shook her head, her heart fluttering in her chest. "You don't owe me anything," she replied softly, but deep inside she knew it was more than that. She had done more than save him. In a way, he had saved her too. Her belief in him had given her strength, and now that strength was being returned. The days continued to blend together. Physical therapy, long conversations, moments of quiet tenderness. Clara couldn't help but notice how Damien had begun to look at her differently, with something more than gratitude in his eyes. She had become his lifeline in more ways than one, and it seemed that the bond between them was deepening. One evening, as Clara helped him settle into bed after a particularly grueling physical therapy session, Damien took her hand in his. His fingers, still weak but gradually regaining strength, curled around hers, pulling her closer. "I don't want you to leave," he whispered, his voice thick with emotion. "Not now. Not ever." Clara's heart skipped a beat, and for a moment she was lost in his gaze. She wasn't sure what it was that held them together, whether it was the shared experience of his recovery or something deeper, more inexplicable. But she knew in that moment that her life had changed forever. "Damien," she whispered, her voice shaking with unspoken words, "I won't leave. Not now. Not ever." The sun had barely set when Clara sat by Damien's bedside once again, her heart heavy with thoughts and emotions that had become all too familiar over the past few weeks. The hospital room, once filled with sterile emptiness, had now become a place of transformation. What had started as a duty, a task as a nurse caring for a wealthy patient in a coma, Clara had never expected this. She had never expected to develop feelings for Damien, the man whose life had been spent in the fast-paced world of technology and innovation. She had been assigned to him because of her competence, her compassion, and her unshakable belief in the possibility of healing, even when everyone else, especially his family, had abandoned him. But now, weeks after his miraculous recovery, Clara had come to realize that she had become just as much a part of Damien's healing process as the medical treatments and therapies he had received, and as much as she had been the one to help bring him back from the brink. Damien had unknowingly pulled her back from a place she hadn't even known she'd fallen into. She had given so much of herself in her care for him, but in return she had found a love she had not thought possible. A love born from the silence and the stillness that had once defined the hospital room. Over the past month, Damien had made remarkable progress. His recovery, which had seemed impossible in the early days, had surpassed even the most optimistic expectations. The doctors, once cautious, now looked at him with awe. The coma that had left him trapped in an unresponsive state for months had slowly faded into the past, and the man who lay before Clara now was no longer just a patient, but someone whose future was full of possibility. Yet amidst all of this, Clara knew that it wasn't just physical recovery that was healing Damien. It was the connection they had built, the trust, the unspoken bond that had grown between them. It was a bond that had started with simple gestures, small acts of kindness and care that turned into hours of conversations about books, childhood memories, and the dreams they both held tightly in their hearts. Clara had always thought of herself as just a nurse, a caregiver, someone who was there to provide medical support and comfort. But somewhere along the way, something had shifted. As she helped Damien regain his strength, she found herself opening up in ways she had never expected, sharing the stories of her own past, the loss of her father, the struggles with her mother's illness, and the quiet fears that kept her up at night. She had never been one to share her vulnerabilities with anyone, let alone a patient. But Damien's presence seemed to make her feel safe in a way she hadn't realized she needed. He listened to her, not as a doctor or a figure of authority, but as someone who truly saw her. And Damien had changed too. At first, his words had been slow, his thoughts fragmented as he navigated the fog of his recovery. But over time, as Clara spoke to him with unwavering patience, as she treated him not as a patient, but as a person, his strength began to return, not just physically, but emotionally. He had always been a man of intellect, sharp and driven. But in those early moments after his awakening, his vulnerability had been palpable. Clara had seen it in his eyes, in the way he struggled to piece together his memories, his identity, and his future. But she never wavered. She stayed with him, even when the doubts and fears seemed to overwhelm him. As the days turned into weeks, their bond grew stronger, more undeniable. It was no longer just about the care she gave him or the medical interventions that helped his body heal. It was about something deeper, something intangible. It was about the way he looked at her, the way his eyes softened whenever she entered the room. It was about the way he had begun to depend on her, not just for the physical aspects of his recovery, but for something far more profound. One evening, as the sun dipped low behind the city skyline, casting the room in golden light, Damien reached out to Clara, his hand trembling slightly as he grasped hers. His eyes, now bright and clear, held a look of something more than gratitude. It was something deeper, something she hadn't been ready to acknowledge until that very moment. It was love. "Clara," he whispered, his voice hoarse from weeks, of silence. I don't know how to say this, but I can't imagine my life without you. I've been given a second chance at life, at everything. But it's you. It's always been you. Clara's heart skipped a beat, the air thick with the weight of his words. She had always prided herself on keeping things professional, on maintaining boundaries. But now, with Damien's eyes fixed on hers, everything else seemed to fade into the background. She had known deep down that this connection they shared was not simply born out of circumstance. There was something real, something undeniable between them. And in that moment, as his hand tightened around hers, Clara knew that she couldn't deny it any longer. I feel the same way, she whispered, her voice barely audible. I didn't expect this. I didn't expect to fall for you, but somewhere along the way, I realized that I couldn't walk away. Not when you needed me. Not when I needed you. The world outside seemed to vanish as they sat there together, two souls connected by something far greater than just recovery. It wasn't just the medicine or the machines that had brought Damien back. It was the love that had been quietly growing between them. It was a love born from vulnerability, from trust, from the act of healing together, both physically and emotionally. Damien's recovery continued at a rapid pace, and soon he was no longer the man who had been confined to a hospital bed. He was strong, determined, and ready to reclaim his life. But as much as he had regained physically, he knew that he could not and would not do it alone. The love he had found in Clara was the anchor that kept him grounded, the force that drove him to keep going, even when the road ahead seemed uncertain. As Damien continued to rebuild his life, he realized that his past, his empire, his wealth, the business world that had once consumed him, was no longer his only focus. He had been given a second chance, and he was determined to use it for something greater. It was Clara's belief in him, her unwavering support that had helped him rediscover his purpose. Together, they decided to create something meaningful, something that would give back to the community, something that would use Damien's resources to help others in need. It was a bond that had started with simple gestures, small acts of kindness and care that turned into hours of conversations about books, childhood memories, and the dreams they both held tightly in their hearts. Clara had always thought of herself as just a nurse, a caregiver, someone who was there to provide medical support and comfort. But somewhere along the way, something had shifted. As she helped Damien regain his strength, she found herself opening up in ways she had never expected, sharing the stories of her own past, the loss of her father, the struggles with her mother's illness, and the quiet fears that kept her up at night. She had never been one to share her vulnerabilities with anyone, let alone a patient. But Damien's presence seemed to make her feel safe in a way she hadn't realized she needed. He listened to her, not as a doctor or a figure of authority, but as someone who truly saw her, and Damien had changed too. At first, his words had been slow, his thoughts fragmented as he navigated the fog of his recovery. But over time, as Clara spoke to him with unwavering patience, as she treated him not as a patient but as a person, his strength began to return, not just physically, but emotionally. He had always been a man of intellect, sharp and driven, but in those early moments after his awakening, his vulnerability had been palpable. Clara had seen it in his eyes, in the way he struggled to piece together his memories, his identity, and his future. But she never wavered. She stayed with him, even when the doubts and fears seemed to overwhelm him. As the days turned into weeks, their bond grew stronger, more undeniable. It was no longer just about the care she gave him or the medical interventions that helped his body heal. It was about something deeper, something intangible. It was about the way he looked at her, the way his eyes softened whenever she entered the room. It was about the way he had begun to depend on her, not just for the physical aspects of his recovery, but for something far more profound. One evening, as the sun dipped low behind the city skyline, casting the room in golden light, Damien reached out to Clara, his hand trembling slightly as he grasped hers. His eyes, now bright and clear, held a look of something more than gratitude. It was something deeper, something she hadn't been ready to acknowledge until that very moment. It was love. "Clara," he whispered, his voice hoarse from weeks of silence. "I don't know how to say this, but I can't imagine my life without you. I've been given a second chance at life, at everything. But it's you. It's always been you." Clara's heart skipped a beat, the air thick with the weight of his words. She had always prided herself on keeping things professional, on maintaining boundaries. But now, with Damien's eyes fixed on hers, everything else seemed to fade into the background. She had known deep down that this connection they shared was not simply born out of circumstance. There was something real, something undeniable between them. And in that moment, as his hand tightened around hers, Clara knew that she couldn't deny it any longer. "I feel the same way," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "I didn't expect this. I didn't expect to fall for you. But somewhere along the way, I realized that I couldn't walk away. Not when you needed me. Not when I needed you." The world outside seemed to vanish as they sat there together, two souls connected by something far greater than just recovery. It wasn't just the medicine or the machines that had brought Damien back. It was the love that had been quietly growing between them. It was a love born from vulnerability, from trust, from the act of healing together, both physically and emotionally. Damien's recovery continued at a rapid pace, and soon he was no longer the man who had been confined to a hospital bed. He was strong, determined, and ready to reclaim his life. But as much as he had regained physically, he knew that he could not and would not do it alone. The love he had found in Clara was the anchor that kept him grounded, the force that drove him to keep going, even when the road ahead seemed uncertain. As Damien continued to rebuild his life, he realized that his past, his empire, his wealth, the business world that had once consumed him, was no longer his only focus. He had been given a second chance, and he was determined to use it for something greater. It was Clara's belief in him, her unwavering support, that had helped him rediscover his purpose. Together they decided to create something meaningful, something that would give back to the community, something that would use Damien's resources to help others in need. It was more than just philanthropy. It was a way for Damien to say thank you, not just to Clara, but to the world that had given him another shot at life. He wanted to make a difference, to leave behind something far greater than the legacy of wealth and power he had once sought.